just as I was coming down, Brian gave me, told me he wanted me to raise something about how I got interested in this particular area that I'm going to talk about. And the reason why I'm interested in this area of talking about how we as a society allocate land and water, and particular focus on First Nations, is really following my students. They were increasingly interested at the University of Guelph in First Nations issues. We were doing research that, as I hope to talk about today, that resonated with some of those themes. And so really, this research that I'm doing now very much follows the lead and interests of my students. And I've been working in this area for about the past 5 years, and it's an important area to try to learn about and to gain institutional insight in. So I'm going to be talking about land and water. I'm going to give a focus on First Nations issues, but the overarching theme of this presentation, the overarching theme is what I'll call an institutional alertness. That is an awareness of institutions and their importance in playing an important role in structuring the relationship between people with respect to things. So what I mean by institutions, it will be enough for the purposes of this presentation to think of them as Douglas North, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, as described as the rules of the game. But I want to make an important point that I will develop throughout the presentations, that institutions not only constrain, so as children we're all familiar with the idea that institutions or rules tell you what you cannot do, but they are also critical and essential to expanding opportunities. Anybody closely watching the NAFTA negotiations today knows that the rules of the game will play a tremendous role in whether trade between nations is diminished or expanded. So that's going to be a theme in discussing institutions in this context of land and water that I want to hit again and again. And I want to say that it's my claim, and other scholars as well, that when those institutions harmonize relationships between people with respect to things so that expands trade over increasing distances with increasingly unfamiliar agents, that it is an important component that leads not only to growth, but to the improvement of human well-being. But when those institutions fail to do that, when they have a pernicious effect, when there's instead of cooperation and harmonization, there is dispute and conflict, then the effect is diminishing. And the localized exchanges that occur do not enhance health and welfare. I just finished a study with my colleagues recently where we tried to look, despite the fact that over the last 20 years or so, there's been a general decline in the rates of undernourishment in the world. We tried to look at the countries where rates of undernourishment were high, and where over the 5-year period that we were studying, they were increasing. Those were countries like the Central African Republic, Pakistan, Afghanistan, places where political instability is such and that the underlying institutions can't harmonize relationships between people, often out of fear of violence. Those are places that aren't succeeding. So I want to keep that context in mind as I go through this presentation. Now, to develop the institutional alertness that I'm going through within the context of the First Nations issues that I'm going to talk about, I want to do that in 3 ways. First, I want to kind of describe to you with compelling metaphors, if you will, metaphors that you can carry with you out of this room and will kind of sit there and be lodged in your animal subbrain so that when you're looking at issues or you're looking at a problem, you'll be alert to the potential of institutions. The second, and this is mainly for the students, I want to talk to you about how I've come upon this general research area, not just through reading, but through experience. So I'm going to take a couple of slides and a little bit of discussion just to talk to you about my post-master's degree experience before I went back to do a PhD. And then third, I want to talk about the kind of research we do as ag economics, and I want to develop that research in the context of this institutional story that I'll be telling through the presentation. So that's the promise of the presentation, if you will. Those 3 things are what I hope to accomplish. No? So let me just begin with a quote that I think is worthy, because this institutional insight we do all the time as ag economists, and we need to start taking what we do well and start thinking about maybe not less conventional issues. And here's a great quote: "The most enduring intellectual capital that agriculture economists can provide to resolve sustainable agriculture issues will be through improved institutional arrangements." All right. That's why we're here. Okay. Now here's the first tattoo, if you will, image tattoo. I want to kind of sear into your animal subbrain. This is a picture of basketball players from the Toronto Raptors, right? And each year in my undergraduate class, I ask my students, I say, what explains the relative differences in salaries amongst basketball players? And I get all sorts of great answers. It's their capacity to shoot a jump shot, it's their speed, it's their basketball IQ, and indeed all of these are compelling reasons that would explain why one basketball player makes more money than another. But they seldom say it's the height of the basketball rim. Now, the basketball rim is set at 10 feet. But if you were to suddenly change the height of the basketball rim from 10 feet to 5 feet, you would radically alter the comparative advantage of basketball players presently. You might argue that shorter people about my height, would be relatively, have a comparative advantage relative to taller people. I might right now be playing professional basketball rather than talking to you. And so my lifelong goal is to change the rim now. Well, that's the point. That's the first point. But the second point, and what I want to develop in the context of this presentation, is that there are rules out there, and there are always these rules out there governing the exchanges in the economy, the relationships between people with respect to things. And there can be rules out there that we're not thinking about in that way. And that's kind of part of the alertness that I want to talk about with respect a little bit to First Nations. All right. I'm going to take a moment here to talk to you about how I've come to have so much passion, really, about this, putting our research in this context. So in 1993, I was a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Lesotho. I'm now a dual citizen, and I was in Lesotho. So in 1993, as many of you may know, apartheid had just ended. Nelson Mandela, who later became the president, was not the president at that time. And the vestiges of a system, of an economic system that segregated people on race, were very apparent to me as a very young man after finishing my master's degree. So I saw firsthand, undeniable, the role that rules play in constraining and leading to deleterious effects. But I also witnessed it firsthand at a more detailed level, the kind of case analysis that ag economists are often looking at. This was one of experience. So this is a picture. I lived in this village, which was about 15 kilometers from the nearest all-year dirt road that you could pass in terms of dirt and get a car across. And this is basically most of the adults in the village that I lived in. And my hand is on the leg of the chief of the village. And I was sent from a project that it was seeded from a nonprofit, but then developed with the elected government, which was didn't have much impact in this area. That the chiefs of this area basically set the effective rules, what we call the de facto rules. I was sent with this idea, and the idea was, look, the soil quality is horrible, the cattle are overgrazing. Here's how we solve this problem. We're going to change the rotational grazing system. We're going to move animals in from one place to another more rapidly than the traditional grazing pattern. And that's going to lead to more soil quality, and that's going to, of course, lead to better cattle, and that's going to improve the well-being. The problem with this plan, of course, I was younger. You were younger too. I was younger then. And I said, great, sounds good. But what I realized almost instantly was that the rotational plan crossed 4 chieftainship jurisdictions. And these chiefs didn't get along. They hadn't been involved in making the plan. There was no transparency. And this project was a complete failure. Now, I did other things, but imagine spending 2 years of your life in a village with a project that was dead from the start. Well, you learn to listen, and you learn to think a lot. And so my first experience and of course, a broader level was a complete failure in a sense in terms of, but it was a complete success in terms of the path that it put me on. So that after that, almost immediately after that, I went to work in the low-income regions of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, specifically, I went to eastern Kentucky, and I was working in formal coal mining areas, and these areas, as you may know, figured prominently in the last U.S. election. Coal is no longer there, and these are the poorest rural regions in the United States now. But the challenge that I was particularly working on, and this anticipates our discussions a bit about First Nations, the challenge that I was working on was one of water quality. And the problem was that the history of the region was such that there were many rural communities. They're rural in the sense that they're located far from a population center, but that their housing structure is dense. So they have urban-like housing in very remote areas. And these urban-like houses in very remote areas were not on municipal water and sewer, despite the fact that they were in some cases close to rural cities, small rural cities that had municipal water and sewer. There's a long history why this is so, but the simplest version of it is that coal companies came in and built housing for their own labor as separate for a variety of reasons from the existing cities that were there. So bring this to the present. So now we're talking 1995 to 1997. These areas were not on water and sewer. When you flushed the toilet, everything went straight into the stream. So this is probably a classic picture. You have the houses next to the railroad track, and behind that will be a small stream. And this was leading to high fecal coliform counts, both in the river and leading to drinking water quality problems. But I had learned something from the failed experience that I had had earlier, and I put together a group of all of the mayors, representatives from all of these communities, and the newspaper, and over the course of the year, we set about a plan on how to address this problem. And what we found was that the cities nearby actually had the capacity to provide water to these areas. But for a number of reasons, this relationship had never been developed. And so we created, if you will, a new institution. We created a county-wide water and sewer district to link the existing municipalities, expand their water systems into regions like this. And today, there are hundreds and close to 1,000 houses on water in this region because of the institutional innovation of the county water and sewer district. And what was neat about this is that the communities that were participating in it voluntarily participated in it. And the county found it advantageous to do as well. So there were these gains from mutual cooperation, from exchanges of services. And this was the kind of promise that I decided as someone examining rural development issues, this kind of promise of an institutional arrangement that could improve the well-being of different groups that I would sort of search for. And after having these experiences in Lesotho and in the Appalachian region of Kentucky, I started to kind of see it everywhere. And I mean everywhere. So what's the promise of Halloween? Right? Well, the one promise is that you're going to see children walking up and down the streets chanting trick or treat. And fortunately, in our situation, many of them will get the latter. The second is those children, our future, are parading themselves in front of us, and I've always find that exciting. But I want to focus in on one in particular. And this is the one that I experienced, that I always, as an economist, take great glee in. My children would walk relatively the same streets. And so in their bag of candy, they would have relatively the same collection of sweets. Not that much difference if you go to the same house together. And they would come into the house with a fixed set of resources and sit down with each other. And what would they do? They would trade. Their happiness, if you will, was made greater from a fixed set of resources by the exchange. But this is more, there's a couple of things that could be like the rim, invisible, that are worth thinking about here. First of all, they came in the house with the assumption that the candy was theirs. right? That's important, right? If we came in the house, I'm sure people do it all sorts of different ways. You could dump the candy in the middle and say we split it evenly. And second of all, each of the participants, at least I would like to think my children, the reason why this repeated year after year, felt that they had autonomy over their decision to trade and, importantly, not to trade, right? Both of those are important. And those are the dimensions, the rim kind of flowing. We've been economists, we've got to keep this alertness. We can compare this, if you will, just to compare this kind of romanticized story with another story that historians often refer to as the Columbian Exchange, which happened sometime at the end of the 15th century, 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. What happens there when the Eastern Hemisphere meets the Western Hemisphere is a radical exchange. And we think about, just to give an example, its effect on Europe was almost immediately with the transfer of corn and even goods that now we sometimes associate with Europe, even though they had their origin, of course, in the Americas, things like potatoes. And so that is argued by scholars to have been a big boon to the population in their area and their economic development. But of course, the history of that was devastation for the indigenous people of the Americas. Disease itself ravished the countryside and killed and made extinct certain people, but also certain different indigenous tribes. But also the exchange was not one between equals who had the right to trade or not. There was a colonialist tendency in these exchanges. And so as we move forward, as we're going to now into the issue of how we look at indigenous issues, we want to keep in mind these questions of who has the inherent right to organize decisions with respect to exchange and the history. So now I want to tackle an issue that my students wanted to tackle starting about 3 or 4 years ago. So you will all know, you've all heard this. If you watch the news today, because of the new census that's come out, they're talking about the heightened indigenous population. You'll all be familiar with this story. Trudeau, in the election process, makes the promise that we're going to end boil water advisories in 5 years. A strident promise for sure, and of course, those grand promises that are hard to keep. And so now we're working through how to do this. But when the promise came, we took it literally. We took it as, how would you do it? What would it mean? What could we do? And so we started having these conversations. In particular, I think my colleague Bethany Livkoff were really driving this. How would we do? We had a lot of great discussions about it. And we thought, well, there's no silver bullet, which I'm going to make this argument, but we can start to look at things. But we had this heightened institutional awareness. So we started to think about the rim. I started to think about my own past experiences. And here's the kind of stuff we started to see. We started to look around us and see things about the rim, if you will, see underlying rules that we hadn't thought of before. I, for example, learned for the first time during these discussions that the city of Guelph provides sewer to a nearby city of Rockwood. That the city of Toronto provides water to York. And when we started looking at rural areas, we started seeing stories like this picture. And all you really have to know about this picture is that the purple area describes a water system, a series of lines that connects a small series of municipalities throughout southern Ontario. A different water system connects the Lake Huron, the lighter blue area there. And we started saying, oh, there's all of these contracts, there's all of these rules that are currently governing small municipalities. But we also started to notice things like this. Well, here's Chippewa of the Thames, and they've had poor water conditions, and they're not part of these systems. Why? And what would be the implication? These are the starts of questions. And certainly from my own experience working on these kind of issues, I started to think, well, why? Are there other places? And indeed there are. Here at Mississaugas of New Credit, for example, their water system is shared through Hagersville. And there's two types of water systems. I'm not going to get into too much detail. One is where water is trucked in from a nearby municipality, and the other is where it's piped in basically to the border, and then typically the distribution of that will occur via the First Nation. And just before coming here, I decided to look from our data set and see if we could find an example one. So this is a Manitoba example. Port Isle Prairie provides water to the Dakota Teepee Nation. So if you sense, the rim became visible. If I can just keep that metaphor going, the rim became visible, and we knew kind of the kind of questions that we wanted to ask. So this is the question we wanted to ask. Is a First Nation reserve and a water sharing agreement less likely to experience a boil water advisory? Now, I'm not going to go into the detail. I was asked to kind of be broad, but I do want to talk a little bit. So with this particular case study, I'm going to go and explain just broadly the kind of econometric approach without very much detail. I'll emphasize a particular result. But one of the important things that we try to do in this applied setting is take data and transform it into interesting relationships, usually to identify a particular association between something like is a First Nation in a water sharing agreement or a municipal type arrangement just as influenced? Are there the prevalence of boil water advisories influenced by whether or not they're participating in these arrangements? All right. So we gathered data through a study that was done and then added to this data, an Egan Burnside study that was done across Canada in 2011. And the information is at the reserve level. So First Nations might have multiple reserves, and it's at the water systems on those reserves. So you can get a sense here of the differences between the prevalence. So here you have the blue areas there are indicating what percentages of these reserves have a water system that's being serviced by a nearby municipality. Okay, I'll use the word MTA, municipal type arrangement, and water sharing contracts kind of interchangeably. So you can see that Manitoba, for example, and Ontario are relatively similar in their prevalence. Now, there are some things that you might, the data that you might immediately expect kind of holds true here. First of all, if we compare reserves that are in contract situations with those that are self-supplied, you can see that those reserves that are in these relationships are less remote. They're in greater proximity. So that's one factor that's going to be important when we assess the implications of our results. And also importantly, the population density matters. So if you're on a reserve and you have, and you're spread out, then a water sharing arrangement may not be appropriate. But if you have greater population density, then these type of arrangements might make more sense. And so a lot of what you might expect on the decision to enter into a water sharing agreement holds true in the summary data. So what we do, and here's the part that I don't want to lose you in. I just want to describe, we've got this data, we've tried to characterize it both in the physical character of reserves, but also in terms of the socio and economic characteristics. And we're going to try to come up with two statements. One is, in words, it's what's the probability of being in a water sharing arrangement? Does it depend on remoteness of the reserve, density, et cetera, and a bunch of other variables? So we want to get that. And in math, we can write that same equation out and it looks something like this. And then we're going to ask the question, okay, well, if they're in, what's the probability of a boil water advisory if they are in a water sharing agreement or they have this municipal type arrangement controlling for all other sorts of arrangements? And this relationship between the participation model and the boil water model takes lots of different forms, but for this presentation, I'm just going to really focus on this one result, and that is that MTA variable. So what's the probability of being in a boil water advisory if you're in a water sharing arrangement? And our hypothesis is that it's reduced, right? That the probability of being in a boil water advisory would be reduced if you're in these water sharing arrangements. And what we find, and then we run these regressions, this is just a selection of one part of the model and a selected set of results, is that we find generally that it is. And there is the central tendency is about 11 percentage point decline in the likelihood of being a boil water advisory if you're in a water sharing agreement. So why this has a number of interesting implications, but really quickly, let me tell you how we're thinking through it. So what we then did, and this is only in Ontario have we done this, we then looked at those First Nations that were in what we'll call the feasible zone, those that are close enough given our data on the information between the distance between municipalities and First Nations that are contracting, how many First Nations that are currently on boil water advisories are in this feasible zone. And it comes out to be about 13%. Now, this is important, and you can see the red areas here. So everything outside of the yellow are not in the feasible zone. You can see that this type of arrangement isn't the solution for boil water advisories in more northern areas, but it is potentially something that we can look at, how to reduce the transactions costs, how to motivate increased interactions. And by the way, this can go both ways. First Nations can be providing water to nearby municipalities. So this is now what we're exploring in the second round of research to try to extend this. Now I'm looking at the time, and I've got 15 minutes. So, and I wanted to allow some time for questioning. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to move through this agriculture zoning discussion because I want to get to the Indian Act and talk about land issues that I think are important, that have the same kind of rim kind of analogy that I want to bring up. But ag economists and myself, we've been looking at issues like agriculture zoning for a long time, since the 1970s. And the reason why I always find it's interesting is that it's always rife with conflict. It's always, agriculture zoning is always a matter of conflict, in part because how you tell somebody they can use their land influences their well-being, and how you use your land usually influences the well-being of your neighbors. And if you look through the literature on this issue, those two questions just come up over and over again. We were talking about some of them at lunch this afternoon. So when I say agriculture zoning, I'm talking about disallowing non-agriculture uses on agriculture land. And the area that's there in green is what's referred to in Ontario as the Greenbelt. And the area that you can kind of see that it surrounds is the fourth largest metropolitan area in North America. That's the Greater Toronto Area. All right? Here's why, in a nutshell, it's always controversial. This is a study that I did some time back. So we asked about 1,000 landowners, are you concerned about farmland loss? And the answer is, oh yeah, 79%. Development restrictions are necessary to preserve farmland? And the answer is, yeah, they're necessary. Would you support zoning restrictions on your land to preserve farmland? And that's, of course, where the rubber hits the road. So without an expanded discussion of the Greenbelt, I want to raise two questions that help me lead into thinking about the Indian Act and a number of very exciting things going on with respect to First Nations. The Greenbelt was essentially an expansion of provincial control over municipalities. So the right, who held the decision-making right, was moved from the municipalities, who might have had more granular knowledge of the land use issues, to the province. And this is well documented in the papers that I provide reference to here. But it's shocking how fast this happened. In November of 2003, for the first time, the provincial government mentioned the idea of a Greenbelt. 1 month later, they put a moratorium across all of the area that you see here, largely called the Greenbelt. And so this was ripe with controversy. So the Ontario Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing said the value of agriculture lands should not be affected by the Greenbelt. Well, that's kind of hard, because if you're altering the future use of land, then you would expect that to be capitalized in the present value. But that was the position. The landowners were upset. They felt like these are the farmers that owned land in the Greenbelt, felt like they were the one paying for this greenbelt through a loss in the value of their land. This is a quote from one of the farmers at the Times, describing their land as their development package, and as their retirement package, and that can you just imagine if we told you you were going to cut your retirement plan, so it's going to be cut in half. And municipalities too, they were concerned because their plans for how land would be developed in their region were usurped. Now I want to make kind of 2 points quickly. The first point is that the issue of who should be making the decision with respect to land is something that agriculture economists in a conventional setting have been examining for years. In fact, our study suggested that there was an effect. I know farmland values fell in close proximity to the GTA, but they didn't fall neither as much or as far out from the GTA, perhaps as some farmers would have thought. So in a sense, our study made nobody happy, but that's what are. But the question is, in a sense, who should it be? The municipalities? Do they have more granular information? Should it be the province? And that's a debate that's gone on, and we study that. And in fact, in places where they found that zoning has raised farm values, a classic study by Henneberry and Barrows in 1990, they actually found that the agriculture zoning was happening more locally, being voted in by farmers. So when that was the process, as opposed to provincial control, they found that there were actually favorable effects on the price of farmland. So this question of who controls and who governs the resource is going to become really front and center when we think about First Nations land issues in a very different context. But the second is, and this is back to the rim example, the second is today in Toronto, there is a endless discussion, endless news coverage about concerns about residential housing prices in the Toronto area. And you hear scarce mention of the fact that 1 million acres of farmland that the supply has been taken out, that areas that would have otherwise been developed has been removed. You'll hear all sorts of compelling stories except for that one. And I say scarce, it has been brought up, but it's not first and foremost on people's mind. It's as if it's become that rim in the background that nobody's paying attention. So one of the future things, and I hope to come back another time, we're planning on doing, is to examine that question using just the kind of methods that I talked about earlier. Now, pointing this out, having a meeting like this, and thank you for the opportunity to come here and say these kind of things, clearly is something that ag economists have prided themselves on for some time. Here's a great quote. Clearly, the institutional rigidities associated with regulations, standards, and non-transferable status rights should continually be drawn to the attention of policymakers. All right. And nowhere could the challenge moving forward with research be more important than trying to deal with the Indian Act. The level of control, which is not now at the provincial level, is in the federal government starting around 1876, but amended several times since then. The Indian Act essentially sets out the rules and regulations at the federal level that will govern First Nations reservations and not only the use of their land, but actually the form of their governance. And so the land and the way it's used, it's not being made at a granular level, it's being made at the federal government. And there are, north of more than 600 First Nations, and they are all homogenized under this Indian Act. So the question of who's making the rules becomes really important. And from a transactions cost story that Derek mentioned, COAS and his importance of thinking about transaction cost story, it's an utter nightmare. Because any change in the rules that govern the land has to not move through, is not decided at the First Nations level. It has to move through approval through the federal government. And there's a long history of scholars who've thought about the transaction cost. That's the cost of actually making this occur. That means kind of substantially, if they want to do business with a nearby area, if there wants to be an investment on this land by a business, they have to get approval. They don't make the decision themselves. They're not the jurisdiction making the decision, whatever arrangement they have to make has to get approved by the federal government. But the rim is changing, and it's an exciting time for research in this area. And I want to make you aware, if you're not, and many of you may be, about what's called the Framework Agreement. So starting in the 1990s, a group of First Nations led by Chief Louis and the West Bank First Nation started moving towards what is referred to now as a Framework Agreement. And the Framework Agreement just basically identifies the principles under which First Nations would have the right to set their own land codes. That's a recognition of their right to make their own rules, opt out of particular sections of the Federal Indian Act, and make rules with respect to land. Do as Chief Louis said in a podcast that I have, he said, do business at the speed of light, reduce these transactions costs, but most importantly, not just about outcomes, recognize almost from a Hayekian perspective, who has the right to make decisions with respect to land. The Framework Agreement almost from the start has been a large number of First Nations have become operational. So there was the Framework Agreement that was signed by First Nations in 1996, and then it was codified into law in 1999 by the federal government. And to start to develop your own land code, a First Nation has to go through a long, transparent process of developing land code, having votes on it. And once you're fully operational, then you're essentially, these are First Nations that are making their own land use decisions with respect to planning and developing and use of land. And today, there's about 73 First Nations that are operational. There's 53 that are in what's called the development stage. There's a long process that has to be gone through. So somewhere between 1/5 and 1/6 of First Nations are in this very exciting new era of being able to set for the first time their own land code. And this is the kind of research that we can do. I mean, the Broken Head Ojibwe Nation, which I guess is just up Route 59 or something, I was trying to figure that on a map. They are, for example, a participant. They're operational under the Framework Agreement. So we've done studies exactly like the one we pointed out, where we've tried to figure out who is participating. So we're at the stage right now where we're just trying to get that participation model. And what we find is fascinating. It's important moving forward. It's important for all of us to think about. What we find is those First Nations that are located in greater proximity to more urban areas are the first ones adopting. Why might that be the case? Because they're in the position to take advantage of what? The promise of Halloween, the promise of exchange, the promise of doing business. We just had Chief Hill from Six Nations to the University of Guelph. We also had Chief Louis, who started the Framework Agreement, to the University of Guelph. Both start off with this statement. We'll start off with this idea. We are ready to do business. We are looking towards that. But that desire is to do so in a way with the promise of Halloween, where people's inherent rights are recognized and people have the right to trade or not. This is just re-emphasizes what First Nations are looking to do, the kind of things. One of the reasons for getting the Framework Agreement is along the lines of looking for these municipal relationships like I described earlier with respect to water. If I could leave you with one image, it would be this. If you want to go out and have an institutional awareness, I would leave you with this. This is the Peace Bridge. It connects Fort Erie, Ontario, with Buffalo of the United States. Two independent countries. That bridge provides market opportunities in ways that neither country could ever anticipate. It becomes the underlying infrastructure for all sorts of expanded opportunity. But to make that bridge, it's more than iron, it's more than steel, it requires a social technology. So this is actually done through what? Well, yes, it takes buildings, it takes builders, and it takes know-how and engineering, but it also takes something called an international compact, an institutional innovation that provides an opportunity, expanded opportunity for exchange that's fundamental and important. And I think that's what we're going to have to be working to better understand. But I'm confident that the skills that are in this room, and particularly my colleagues in ag economics, are well prepared to explore this with the tool sets that we have. And I think it's in keeping with the tradition of this department. So I want to end with the very quote that I started with. The most enduring intellectual capital that agriculture economists can provide to resolve sustainable agriculture issues will be through improved institutional arrangements. Now let us show creativity by proposing new, imaginative institutional arrangements. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm going to divide the questions here into two pieces. First of all, I'm going to invite some questions, particular students. I know there's a number who had a few commitments. And then to the outside, yes, five for you that are outside the university, we have a reception after the dean's office. And to those of you that are outside the university, and if you're inside and really want to come to display too, Rex following the lecture. So why don't we have a few questions, and then I hope some of the students decide to stay, but I know that there's a few of them that had some commitments in terms of carpool needs, so on. So some questions from you students or others. Gary, you're sitting there, and I can see that you're going to ask questions. Okay.
Ray, I was just going to ask, are the water sharing agreements covered under the OD Act, or are those different kind of land use, like mine type?
They're allowed under the Interact, and when we studied this within the province, First Nations are allowed to pursue relationships with nearby municipalities. Without going through. It's an example of, or the Indian Act allows for it, I should say, but yeah. And there's been increase, and I can't get this right now, but we're actually looking at it, and the province has increased. So the province has clear mandates. They actually ask for sharing arrangements where possible to lower tier municipalities, but there's not such a relationship. And so we think that this is exactly what we're exploring now, this deep institutional detail. We think that that might be the kind of thing that we can explore more, how to incentivize those relationships, or what currently incentivizes the relationships between municipalities.
Another question. Bill.
You described the probability relationship between the our distance to urban areas, water sharing agreements, and hinted at the relationship between reaching the self-governance of land to availability to urban markets. Is there an overlap between those two sets of data? Like, is it more likely the a First Nation that has a water sharing agreement, or also is looking towards the other model for land use?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we just haven't studied that, but thank you. I will, and we should. And like I said, what's been a challenge for me personally is that and I think all researchers can appreciate this, is how you slowly have to move your research program to tackle an area that you might be skilled at kind of examining empirically, but don't know a lot of this institutional detail. So we really are at the beginning stages of starting to cut additional questions. So whether there's a portfolio of things that are happening on First Nations because of their proximity, is a great empirical question. Let me say, as I'm saying this, there's a great book called The Quiet Revolution by Chris Alcantara and Jen Nels. Chris Alcantara is a political scientist now, I think at London. And they have documented, not necessarily empirically, the expansion over the last 10 years of all sorts of cooperative arrangements, not just water, but fire services and trash collection and all these kind of things. And so, they have this great line in the book where he says, so while we've been kind of fetishizing the perpetual and endless conflict between the federal government and through the Indian Act and First Nations. As we've been doing this, there's been this kind of increased exchanges between municipalities and First Nations, which has gone understudied. And I actually think it's empirically really understudied. And so just advance that as a potential area to explore more.
As an infrastructure identity, have you considered education as an institution and the transportation infrastructure? We're going to look at those as well.
I hadn't considered it, but it's really interesting. Actually, I started thinking about recently. I heard I'll just talk about the roads. I think I would like to look at more international relationships and study the character of those almost from a legal and an economic context, the character of those relationships, and then see if I can abstract that and do the kind of analysis that economists can do. The bridge is really an interesting example, right? Because it's kind of like, and I'm losing the word now, but what's a computer like? It provides a basic infrastructure of opportunity. So the bridge connects people, but what is being connected and the innovations that are going on between individuals, it's a real economic driver. So I started to become more interested. And of course, the internet does that too in certain forms. And what are these things out there? And what are the institutions that make them work in different settings? And so the bridge in this point is that I'm trying to really bring about is that neither the United States nor Canada feels threatened about their autonomy, and lots of exchanges going on all the time. But it does require more than an engineering solution to that. It requires a social technology, and being alert to that, I think, is part of how we can kind of meet what Daryl suggested that we go out there and do. Look for those opportunities. Yes.
My understanding is the Indian Act is in the process of being abolished. That would be by increase the opportunities for these arrangements.
So you might know more about that than me. I don't know. The Indian Act, as historically, has been talked about being abolished many times, and so I don't know where exactly we are. We know we created 2 new divisions of government, and we're trying to deal with that. But I don't know exactly what the timetable is on that, and I don't know enough detail to give you a really good answer. So, yep.
I was taken aback by the slide that that showed the percentages of First Nation groups that had agreements, watershed agreements, and those who did not. Some of them in Manitoba and Ontario were above the 90%. My question is,
wait a minute, what above
90%? As I understood from the slide, of the First Nation groups did not have
yes.
Watershed agreement.
Let's see if we can share that question with.
Yeah. So, from our data, the water systems on First Nation reserves in Manitoba, 93% of them would be self-supplied. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's from
Just to elaborate on what my question specifically is, and you also mentioned the Checoas, my pronunciation, First Nations, as an example of a group that does not have this watershed agreement.
That does. The Dakotas Tippewa. You mean here in Manitoba? Or are you talking about Ontario?
Not specifically sure about the location of it.
All right.
The First Nation group, I just thought of one.
Okay, so the one did not, yeah.
Yeah, so
in Ontario.
Is it only the remoteness of the First Nation groups that affects, or is the reason why they do not have a shared water supply with say, nearby rural cities, or other obstacles? I
think one of the, if you want to, so if you want my guess of what's not in that model, that's really important that we're getting anecdotally. So we're now working with political scientists and of First Nation research to actually go and try to probe these kind of questions. But one is that there is a sense oftentimes that water infrastructure is important to is an important symbol of autonomy. And so First Nations may or may not want to be in a water sharing arrangement. They actually may want to work through the federal government to create their own water system. and supply, they may view that as an important detail. And my guess is that's part of what, if I had the factor that's not in the model, that's very important. And so there may be cultural reasons for that. There may be economic reasons for that. Some people look for when I was working in the Appalachian region, even though they were a rural community, was actually putting in a water system in this rural community. And it made sense. And at the time we were working with these groups of people, and we were like, well, why wouldn't you just want to get it from this nearby, what's called the city of Whitesburg that was nearby? Why wouldn't you? And they were, we want the jobs. And this would be 2 jobs. But those are the kind of things that may be going on there that we're not picking up.
Just to follow up on that, the percentages were much higher in the Yukon and BC, and I was wondering if it had anything to do with they have different treaties.
Right.
So.
It could be the different treaties in Yukon. It could be that's very difficult to provide water system, and almost all of those are trucked. So,
Question back. Speak loud enough so the people behind you can hear it.
I was just noticing on that table where you showed the sort of the reduction in water borders, oil. When there was an agreement for the MTA, the location of the reserve. So BC and BC and Manitoba seem to be quite protected. Like almost the values were twice as high as the MPA. Is there something provincial?
Yeah, I don't. Those are great questions. So we did find. So there are. So just to kind of build on this question, when we run this regression, we have variables that try to account for differences amongst each provinces, and those variables turn out to be statistically significant. So those variables, whether you're in Manitoba or somewhere else, influences the likelihood of a boil water advisory, or also in participation. Those variables turn out to be significant. So, and those are usually, we don't really know the underlying reasons why that might be true. Could be, well, we try to control for those other reasons, but they come up.
Other questions?
Yeah, just when you talked about the framework agreement, reading great quote, it would improve institutional arrangements.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it comes down to trust. And so I'm curious, you've seen these 73 communities, they've got these agreements. How are they building the trust to want to create innovation? It's trust between the municipality and the what are some steps that they're doing to build trust to help us drive these framework agreements?
I mean, I don't know. I can tell you there's a federal initiative where they've sat down and they're working with First Nations and nearby municipalities, and they have these sessions where they bring the municipalities in to meet with First Nations, and they discuss ongoing issues. They discuss the rituals that would occur when you go to a meeting, for example, and how they might differ between the municipal government sort of immediately getting to business versus a First Nation where they might have a different type of format for starting off a meeting. And we did sit in on these type of meetings, and I think those are examples of trust building. But I think I think in a sense, trust kind of happens over repeated exchanges that work out. And my guess is, the reason why trade works between my children is we would have stepped in if my son hit my daughter over the head and grabbed the chocolate, and that the real trust that we can work towards will not be sort of this just sitting down and having a meeting, will be kind of exchanges that have endured over time that lead to the next kind of exchange. And so that's my sense of how that happens. I do have an interview, a podcast with Chief Louie about the framework agreement and his role in initiating it. It's on Fair Talk. I think it's a really good discussion about the detailed history of what they went through to make the framework agreement and the motivations for doing it. But you get the sense that in some cases there's just this leadership. There's this sense that there are opportunities for gains to exchange, and they want to make that happen. So.
The land code.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that's zoning. But I'm also curious, so I wouldn't mind hearing what
Yep, I'll develop that if you like.
land code is. I'd also like to know if it includes the assumption of acquiring more land or selling land?
Okay. So the land code is broader than just zoning, though it includes it. The first thing that comes out of the framework agreement is the recognition and that the governance of land will, with certain principles, will reside with the First Nations. So the land code could be anything from how deep you're going to put a water or a sewer line to how you're going to make a lease arrangement. Currently, if you made a lease arrangement with, say, a nearby company, that would have to go through the federal government where it's placed and be approved. That approval process, I think it's the first time, Chief Louis says, it's the first time in Canadian history that the First Nations are recognized with the right to and not only apply rules, but to develop those rules as they see fit with respect to land. Now, First Nations can acquire land currently, but one of the principles of the First Nation Framework Agreement that was ratified and referred to as the First Nations Land Management Act, which is the Canadian's government, is that the size of the First Nation cannot be diminished. So the principles that allow for self-governments disallow for a decision that would reduce the size of the reserve in terms of their ownership. Because there are other proposals that have been floated. Most famously, the other one that's not come about is the First Nations Property Ownership Act, which is not the framework agreement. That gives First Nations fee simple ownership and would allow them to sell the land. That's not part of the framework agreement. I'm happy to clarify that. It's a very important point.
You know how many reserves have taken up that?
The First Nations Property Ownership Act it's not existing. It was put out and it was argued, but it kind of died somewhere in the legislative process. So the framework, but it's often described, but they shouldn't be conflated. They're very different things.
So there's still real limitations for being able to manage.
Well, there are limitations that are guided by broad principles that were laid out in the Framework Agreement in 1996. So the inherent right to self-govern the land is now placed with the First Nations who are fully operational. So there's various forms. There's customary rights. There's occupational permits. There's Six Nations has something that's close to fee simple that allows people to use land, but does not. This precludes fee simple ownership to the extent that it could be land on the First Nation could be alienated from the First Nation. So a First Nation person given a certificate of occupancy couldn't sell that land off the reserve to a non-First Nation person. So that's a limitation. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Sir, basis your research and thinking about this problem, what was your advice that you would give to Mr. Trudeau to solve this oil water problem within 5 years?
Great. Well, he may have been up, but so here's the way. That's a lot in the timing of that. First of all, I think you have to define exactly what you mean by eliminating boil water advisory. So economists love to do this. What's the starting point? I would love to hear, and I think academics can participate in this. So first of all, do you mean complete elimination, or do you mean that the prevalence of a boil water advisory would be the same on First Nations as it would in non-First Nations? And all of those kind of very rigorous, because right now it's a moving target that doesn't seem so precise to me. So that would be that's how I would start. And the second, I would look into this, there's going to be a portfolio of efforts. And I would immediately look into, potentially on a short-term basis, the research that we've done. Now, the research may or may not be right, but in the short term, we believe that there are municipalities in close jurisdiction to some percentage of the boil water advisories that could provide water to those. And to compare the cost of doing that with the alternative, it seems to me that the approach now is largely investing in infrastructure. At least in the short run, that could be part the portfolio. So defining the terms, looking immediately for how you can get down to 13 to 15%. I should say that this research has, if you don't mind me just kind of building off your point, after we did this study, we got very excited. And then somebody said, yeah, but what do you know about municipalities? And we're like, oh, yeah, we better study that too, right? Because this is the interesting thing about this research. You talk about the supplier and the demander and supplier, what are going on? And we've been doing this careful research of whether or not cities may have water that on the short-term basis that they could provide. And we actually found doing a study, and I didn't come prepared to talk about it, but it is published in Water Resources Economics this year with David Warden. We actually did a study that identified that the rules, the underlying standards, created a very conservative amount of water that would be available. So in an emergency basis, at least for the short time, if you change those rules, you would be in a position to provide water to nearby areas. And importantly, in the paper, we argue that you could change those rules with very minimal loss in the probability of a municipality not having enough water. And so that's the kind of, this research its most immediate child was this other research so that we could see if in the short term that might be a possibility. So that's all I can say. The far north areas, there's a tremendous challenges. And that's the limitation of my research in terms of speaking to it's a great question.
So if I understand this correctly, I think you're saying that the institutional ability of the India prevented us from other First Nation dealing with the issue of contaminated water. Is that what I take for this, and what other things?
So I was, that's the institutional rigidity with respect to the land issues, I'm arguing has constrained broadly economic development, and that the transactions cost with respect to land. So I was using that as the kind of the theme that I was trying to get across was failure and success, and looking for opportunities for institutional innovations that have allowed for success and building on those, and looking at examples with respect to First Nations that have not worked so well. So I guess what I'd like you to take away is that look at these boil water advisory situation and look at the relationships that seem to be merging between municipalities and First Nations. And I view that as a success, and one that we need to build more on in terms of examining, in terms of research, the kind of empirical research that I discussed, but also in terms of the type of institutional innovation that Dr. Kraft suggested that we move forward with. With respect to land, I'm arguing that the Indian Act basically removes the appropriate jurisdiction from First Nations to the federal government, does not allow First Nations to basically enter into the promise of exchange that I described with the promise of Halloween, the kind of romanticized exchange that I talked about, and therefore constrains economic development. So I was really tackling land and water. I was describing what I think is a success that we have to look at in terms of the rim that you might not have thought about before. And I was looking at the First Nations the First Nations Land Management Act as a potential success getting out of a bad situation with respect to land caused by the Indian Act. Success, failure.
I prevented them to use land for any purpose.
It disallowed them to use land to make decisions with respect to their land outside of the set of rules that were set in place by the Indian Act. So the Indian Act, I think, has 35 sections that deal, I might be right, roughly close to that deal with land and how it shall be used. And they have a process that deals with land and how it should be used. And to change those processes, which First Nations do from time to time, or to enter into leases, etc., with nearby areas, they have to go through the federal government for approval. And the First Nation, the Framework Agreement and the First Nations Land Management Act is an institutional innovation that hopefully will address this. We're studying right now who's adopting it, but the next set of studies have to tell us whether it works or not in terms of economic outcomes. That's the promise of a whole set of research that we can start to get into. I was telling, and maybe I'll just make this point. I asked Sandy Worley. Now, Sandy Worley is a former chair of the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Guelph, and he was an outstanding researcher and a well-respected leader. And I said, Sandy, why did Ag-Econ departments come about? And he said, well, only Sandy can say it this way. Basically, there were a bunch of rural businesses out there that weren't doing so good, and Ag Economics departments came about and said, go solve that problem. So those rural businesses were farms, of course, and in the 1930s and the 1940s and 50s, and in the emergence of our department, there were many millions of people in the farm population that weren't doing as well off as the rest of the country. Now today, so that was that's what he said. And I think about that a lot in trying this effort to try to move towards this area that I'm not that familiar with, away from the conventional areas that I am. I think about what he said a lot, because today, well, we have about the farm population, that's the children and the families of farm, that's about, the Canadian population is about 600,000. And those people are doing, thanks to the research that we continue to do in these departments in part, and our efforts, they're doing pretty good. They're doing about as, they would be comparable to other people in terms of their income. But we have twice as many. We have a strange similarity. We have more than 1 million, or the new census data came out today. Twice as many, for sure, Indigenous people who seem to fit the mandate that Sandy Worley suggested, a group of rural people, rural businesses and rural communities, autonomous Indigenous populations that are part of Canada, that aren't doing as well as other people. Go out there and see what we can do. I think I can't really improve much on what Daryl said. So
I think that's a great place to end that. I'd like to hold a pause for a minute, go out to see what we can do. And I think in the spirit of Daryl Kraft and really having a theme that is really quite, I think, different from the themes that we've had the first 8 years, has been very, very timely. It's been excellent at the University of Manitoba, where there has been a great focus and recognition that, in fact, that's exactly what the university wants to do, is go out and try to make a contribution to those outstanding issues. And so on behalf of that, the University of Manitoba, Faculty of Agriculture and Food Science, the Daryl F. Kraft Lecture 2007, in recognition of your contribution to the legacy of Daryl F. Kraft, Department of Agricultural Economics, Agribusiness and Agricultural Economics. Thanks, Dr. Brady Deaton, Jr.
Yep.
For your presentation of the 9th Annual Daryl F. Kraft Lecture entitled Land and Water, Issues and Approaches in Canada, First Nations and Abroad. And we invited Brady on the condition that he had shelf space or had wall space to be able to hang up our award.
I do. Thank you very much. I'm very honored. Thank you.